Okay, you're
Are we
live.
live? Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. And the first thing is the land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we live and work in Mi'kmaq as a steward of the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. Moving along, there's been a change in the agenda. We're going to defer topic 2, municipal committees. I'm looking for a motion to approve the agenda as amended.
I'll move it.
Moved by Warden Weber,
I'll second.
seconded by Councillor Coolin. All those in favor?
Oh, I've got a question. Sorry. So, we've got so much stuff on the plate. When you look at it, I really don't know how we're ever going to get anything accomplished with. Just a rough guess is a dozen or more items for strategy and policy meetings, and we get through about 1 or 2 a meeting. We're so jammed up in how we do scheduling and how we can get guests in and try to deal with things in timely fashion. I'm really lost at 1 or 2 a month that we can accomplish a healthy process with that many things on the table that all are some relevancy of importance to other agencies and organizations too. Thank you, CAO. I think that's something I get addressed to you.
I can give you a little bit of insight. So we try to keep our policy and strategy agenda to 2 or 3 items. That's sort of per the conversations we've had when we established them, because they're broader topics with a little bit more involved discussion. And so for our June 19th one, we already have 3 scheduled. We're out to moving this. If we move this now, we'd be looking at July. So without adding some additional meetings in there, we have about 13 topics scheduled right now, kind of on the list of things to talk about. Did you want to?
Is Councillor Zeno?
I'm just going to say, if it's the will of the group, I have no problem adding more strategy if needed, you know, as, you know, I think that, you know, let's put more on if that's what we got to do to get through the overburden.
Yeah, we can look at, we can either send emails out or we can schedule them now if you wanted to.
Send emails.
I think
Send emails? Okay.
kind of bad.
All right.
You spend half
Okay,
an hour trying
we'll
to
send
pick
you.
It's
days.
very embarrassing.
Okay.
Thank you.
All those in favor for the approval of the amended agenda? Opposed? Motion's carried. Moving along, we're going to do the presentations, and we'll hand it over to the planning team.
All right, so Paul and I are back, and we're going to do this kind of as a joint presentation. So I'm going to start with just a fairly brief overview of the current slate of environmental protections that we have enacted, and then Paul's going to go through a number of options for how we may, or council may choose to provide relief to some of those. So just as a quick reminder, this is something that's been, I think, really kicked around a little bit ever since our lakefront overlay and our watercourse setbacks came into effect in 2020 about having some sort of a relief mechanism. But then in particular, there was a property owner on Vaughan Lake who ran into an issue when he moved his building to deal with an encroachment issue onto a neighboring property and inadvertently moved it so that it was still within the lakefront overlay, and he unfortunately didn't check with development first, so that it became a violation issue. And he came to council to present the issue, and council asked staff to come back to do some research and come back with some options for not just that specific situation, but generally across the board. So Paul's got a whole bunch of really good options that he'll walk you through. We have recommendations, but we've got options for sort of like from A to Z or A to Z. Yeah, so just a quick overview of what is currently in place so that hopefully everyone will be on the same page when we start talking about potential changes. So currently in the municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw, we have the lakefront overlay, the water courses, water bodies, and wetlands setback, and then the lakeside zone. So we'll just quickly go through each of those because even the names themselves can become a little confusing, and it's very easy to sort of put one in place of the other. So starting with the lakefront overlay, I think this is probably the most straightforward and easiest to understand in terms of its application. So it's applicable to all lakes that are shown on Schedule B of the land use bylaw. So there's an actual map and you can see, is my lake, affected by the lakefront overlay? And from our perspective, we ran into this issue of what is a lake, and there's no official definition, but, so in 2020, we basically have what I would consider to be all the lakes that this applies to. The lakefront overlay setback applies to your main building, so that would be either the commercial building or a house if it was a resident, or cottage if it was a residential lot. And it also includes impermeable surfaces or hard surfaces, so that includes the buildings, obviously, but it also includes paved areas. The regulations, the primary one that we almost always talk about is that there's a 20-meter setback from the high water mark between the main building and the high water mark. So main building has to be at least 20 meters or 66 feet from the high water mark. There is also this regulation on impermeable surfaces that within that 20 meters from the high water mark, only 25% of that area can be covered by either buildings and or paved areas. That one doesn't come up as often, but it's still an important one in terms of slowing down runoff from reaching the lake and the objective behind this. Currently, in terms of existing relief options or exemptions to the lakefront overlay, there's nothing specific, but we do have language that small accessory structures, so that would be like a small shed that didn't include any sleeping quarters, firefighting impoundments, so that could be pumps or hydrants, and then structures related to water systems, again, pumps or a small building that had a pump house in it, are permitted within that 20 meters. But other than that, there's no exemption to it. And another thing that's interesting that'll come up again here as we talk about all of these things is that all lots that are covered by the lakefront overlay require a development permit, and that includes in the general basic zone where most often a development permit is not required. The reason that we have it set up that way is because in order to determine whether or not a proposed building is too close to the water, they have to go through the permit application. So if they don't, we'd end up with a bunch of potential violations where people would build too close and, if you're following along in your package here, there is a map on the next slide. So this just, like I said, shows all the lakes that are covered by the lakefront overlay. And the red line there is to scale. So that essentially is the setback. So, when you zoom in on that, you can get a better sense of it. But that essentially shows you no new main building should be within the red lines around each of those lakes. The next one that we'll talk about is the water courses, water bodies, and wetlands setback, and it's a mouthful. And this one applies, so basically, I think you could think of the lakefront overlay and this one as being similar in intent, but the application is different, and that's why we have both currently. So this applies to all water courses, water bodies, and wetlands that show up on the Nova Scotia 1 to 10,000 topographic database. So that's a provincial layer that's maintained and updated by the province. And so in this case, it makes a lot of sense to use that rather than try to keep our own database up as to where new wetlands are or where things have dried up in the past. Anytime that a development permit is triggered in our land use bylaw, this setback would apply. And the reason I say that is because that means normally if you're in the general basic zone, that means these setbacks are not going to apply. Because most 1 to 4 dwelling units or small commercial buildings in the general basic zone don't need a permit. Similar to the lakefront overlay, the regulation here is a 20-meter setback from the ordinary high water mark. So it's the same setback that the lakefront overlay requires. In terms of relief options for this, wetlands, water courses, and water bodies, what exists today, again, similar to the lakefront overlay, small accessory structures, firefighting impoundments, and water systems are permitted within that 20 meters. Additionally, if a property owner feels that the 1 to 10,000 is inaccurate, either in the case of there not being a wet area there or that the course of a water course has changed over time, they can have usually it would be a surveyor or an engineer, submit a report to that effect, and then that will allow them to build, subject to whatever the new water course is. We have, I think, had one example of that used in District 5 since these have been in place. And in that case, it did solve his issue, but.
That was David Richardson's house.
That's right, yeah, and it was a good use of this, because the water course was definitely not going through the property, it was ditched long ago, and so it was no longer an issue. But outside of that, either if it exists or not, there's no relief, so there's no option to go down to 15 meters or 10 meters, it's either the water course is there, or it's a 20-meter setback. So same as the lakefront overlay in that sense. The last one we'll talk about is the lakeside zone, and where the first two are quite similar in their intent. The lakeside zone is quite a bit different, and is really a separate kind of planning tool that we've been using in the last couple of years. So this is a specific actual zone on our zoning map, and it's approved by council on basically a case-by-case basis. And traditionally, as we've discussed every time this has come up, it usually has strong support from the landowners around the lake or water body. In terms of what it allows, it's one to two dwelling units on a lot, allows for forestry processing, and contains regulations for farm animals, which we don't normally regulate in most of our other zones. It prohibits commercial and industrial use, and requires a vegetated buffer of 10 meters, so you need to leave most of the vegetation. And also a larger minimum lot size of 0.4 hectares, or about an acre, than we would normally call for. So in terms of, again, relief options, there are none there other than as it's written in the vegetated buffer to allow for some clearing for views and access to the water. And then I guess just the last point to note on the lakeside zone, so if applicable, based on where things are and what's being built, you could have a situation where the lakeside zone and either the water courses, water bodies, or the lakefront overlay would work together and apply to a lot. So the next page is just our one example of the lakeside zone, so that's Shearbrook Lake, our side of that, has the zone applied. In that case, the depth was 300 meters, so that's what the blue line represents there. Just about finished here, so just, I guess, kind of, again, just, this is some background on our general basic zone, which we already talked about. So the general basic zone applies to most land north of Highway 103. There's a few exceptions, being the Hamlet zone in New Ross, Kaiser Meadow, which has some industrial zoning, and then Sherbrook Lake, which we just talked about, which has the lakeside zone. The other significant area that I'm often inclined to miss is Blandford Peninsula. So basically below Mill Cove, it's general basic zone as well. So that's another big chunk, and I always try to catch myself. It's not just inland. We do have areas, near the coast as well. In the general basic zone, it is our least restrictive zone. As we talked about a little bit, no development permit is required for up to 4 dwelling units on a lot, and commercial uses that are less than just over 10,000 square feet. And so again, that means that the water courses, water bodies, and wetlands setback is not applicable to those kind of developments in the general basic zone. The general basic allows all land uses except for heavy industrial, which is relegated to Kaiser Meadow. So a couple of thoughts on this, I guess. The general basic zone, as many councillors would be familiar with, particularly those of you that have been around the table for a while, it's a long-standing zone. It was a way for the municipality to have zoning across the municipality, but still finding that balance between being, what was potentially would have been seen as too restrictive. So it does have a history, and I think it's served a purpose really well. However, that being said, and I got this firsthand when I was drafting the 2020 plan, it does necessitate a more complex land use bylaw, because the general basic zone works almost opposite to how every other zone works. So typically, zones that permitted uses are listed, and anything that's not listed is prohibited. And in the general basic zone, and again, with good reason, by design, it actually works the other way around. So basically, everything's permitted unless it's listed as being prohibited. And so because of that, there's sections in the bylaw where we have to have language to kind of explain, for this zone, it works differently. The general provisions, which normally apply to all zones in the same way, work differently in the general basic zone.
If I could ask a question.
Sure.
Maybe I misheard you.
Nope.
So when you talk about the general basic, so the lakefront zone, none of that applies in general basic?
The lakefront overlay is the one thing that does apply, and this is where it starts to get a little bit,
Oh,
a
okay.
little
This is
bit
why we're
complicated.
having this
Yeah,
session.
I just, yeah, okay, thank you.
And so the lakefront overlay does apply in general basic across the board, that map with the red circles around every lake.
And other lakes.
Yeah, so that does, the lakeside zone would actually replace the general basic zone. So you wouldn't have a situation where you have lakeside zone and general basic zone, it would be one or the other. And then the wetlands, watercourses, and water bodies, it is applicable in the general basic zone, but it doesn't apply for most projects because unless you trigger a development permit, it doesn't kick in. So it's only for larger, like apartment buildings and large commercial that would trigger that. So this is a good example of kind of what I'm saying, that by necessity, because of the way this is set up, it does become a little bit more complex. It all works, it's just a little harder to, explain in a really straightforward way, yeah. So this is not necessarily a recommendation, but just a point that if at any point the general basic zone were to change so that it did require that basic development permit for, a single unit home or a commercial business, that would allow us to probably do away
Tidy
with
up some.
one of those two sets of regulations and move to a single set that would kind of apply more broadly. And Paul will get into a little bit of that in some of the options. What's that?
Or a lot.
A lot of that, yeah. So the next page is just the zoning map, so again, you can get a sense of the general basic zone. So we do, it's a significant portion of the municipality, and so that means both, some of our regulations don't apply to a large portion, but also if we were to consider a change, like a permit change, there's a lot of people that are affected by it and a lot of property that's affected by it. So the last thing I wanted to touch on before we turn it over to Paul here, in terms of a relief option is a variance, because that's oftentimes what would seem as the obvious solution. Why don't we just have a way to allow a variance to our watercourse setback? And so this is essentially based on past research and discussion with Sam. So the Municipal Government Act specifically lists what items can be varied in a land use bylaw, and there's some flexibility. There's a list, and then you can do some additional ones. But the specific one that would potentially be relevant here is size or other requirements related to yards. And so the way that that's been interpreted internally and through legal advice is that a side yard setback, a front yard setback, those are the kind of things we're talking about there. But a watercourse setback, and maybe we, might be able to get into, like, if it was worded differently, if it was a watercourse yard setback, maybe would that change things? I'm not 100% sure, but the answer that we've gotten is that a variance is not possible for at least the way it's set up now through a watercourse setback. And so that's why Paul's gonna go through a series of other options outside of the variance process that potentially could offer relief. So hopefully that was fairly clear. Happy to go back to any of that if it gets confusing as we go through here to, what's what, but yeah, I'll turn it over to Paul. And I'm just gonna run next door and grab something I forgot.
So the first slide here is potential relief overlay, or overview, I should say. So these are the slides that are coming up. I'll do a little background. Talk about the village plan exemption, so that'll kind of contradict a little bit of what Garth was saying, but there's an exemption in the new village plan. Jurisdictional scans, so I've looked at some other examples around the province. Talk a bit about what types of reports should be submitted for these, and then several other things there as we'll go through. So then the next slide is background. So as Garth said, there was one specific matter that came up with the cottage that moved and such. So as far as I understand, they get calls about this every so often at development as well. And then there was a plan of subdivision matter that came up around the same time, where when they got approval for the plan of subdivision, it shows a water course, but we didn't have the setbacks yet. But they never actually acted on creating the lots, but now they're imposed with a setback that they weren't anticipating.
I've got regulated separately there, so there's the subdivision bylaw that would really deal with that, but we won't get into the plan of subdivision. It's not in, substance of that is not in the planning documents we're talking about here. So there was council direction to look into this last year. So then just so the report that came with this, just to confuse you, there's two sets of options, but I just want to point out that so there's matter-specific options that I'll present after we'll do a little portion of things. But then at the end, there's combined options that you can consider as well that kind of sum up those other matter-specific options. So then, yeah, I think there is a lot in here, but essentially I think it's like, should we do a development permit process or a site plan approval process is kind of the basic thing we're looking at here as I went through the
Oh, I feel
through
cool
the
here from
material.
somewhere.
So,
Wish I was sitting by the water.
so jurisdictional scans. So I've looked at a number of municipalities around to just get a sense of what other people are doing. As we know, the geography is pretty diverse, and municipalities vary in size as well. So, for instance, our municipality is different than the town of Mahone Bay that has maybe one waterway or two. So I'll go through a few of them as we move along here. Some of them also do have minimum elevations above the water, which we haven't gone into. There likely would need to be some kind of engineering aspect that would go along with that. But there is some places that do have minimum elevations as well as setback horizontal distance. So, and then also just pointing out there, actually, I don't see any other lakefront overlay setups in these other municipalities. So, the next page, I have some of the examples there. So the region of Queens, they have 15-meter setback, whereas ours is 20. And they do have an exemption that to bring it down by half with a qualified professionals report, which I'll go through in the next couple of slides. And they do have an elevation associated with their exemption as well. So there's a development permit process that they have for vacant lots. And what they've decided to do is limit how big a footprint you can make in a lot is basically constrained from the size the lot was created when it was created.
Excuse me, Councillor Vino has a
Yeah,
question.
I have a question. Queens, for example, is it, it says by development permit. Oh, I see. Okay, I thought that was as of right. I guess development permit's close to that,
Yeah.
but, yeah, all right, fair enough. Yep, all right.
And then the last point on that region is existing buildings can be renovated, moved as well, as long as the footprint doesn't change. So District of Lunenburg, just brought this up because that's where the water supply is for the town, even though it's in modal. So they don't actually have an exemption. They do have the same setback that we use. Dartmouth has a 20-meter setback, and then they also have additional distance depending on the actual slope of the land going down to the water. And then they have vacant undersized lots created prior to 2006. There's an exemption for that. And then one other thing I noticed in there is, in the village plan exemption, that you can't have a small accessory structure within the area as long as it's not anyway, not important, but they do have a limit on how big these accessory structures can be within the setback. Antigonish, so the first two examples are what they have existing, but then I have one that they're proposing. But they do have, they have no exemption in the central Antigonish. They have no exemption eastern Antigonish either. They do have a slope, distance, elevation parameter in there. And they do limit how big accessory structures can be, and then also how much deck can be within that area as well, which we'll come to again later. But then their draft land use bylaw that they're looking at doesn't have an exemption, and it has the 50-foot setback. And then the next page has a couple more. So Mahone Bay, brand new land use bylaw. They've got a 10-meter setback, whereas ours is 20, and they have an exemption down to 4 meters with a report from a qualified professional. They do have the elevation aspect, but I believe that's because they know their waterways and how the slopes of them are.
So Paul, if I could ask, so most of these have an elevation element to them. So when they're saying, so I'm just taking Mahone Bay, for instance, minimum of 2 meters in elevation. So if you don't have that, you can't, regardless of how far you go back, if you don't have the elevation?
Yeah, so Mahone Bay, and they are, and I don't have the document right in front of you, but it also applies to the ocean side as well as their inland waterways. And like Paul said, they've done some studies of their downtown to see what sea level rise and climate change, what the sort of, and so their regulations, and correct me if you know that I'm wrong, but I know on the ocean, at least on the ocean side, I think it would be the same. They have actually 3 different levels of elevation depending on what the use is. So if it's like a park or storage, those kind of things, it has a lesser elevation. I believe the 2 meters is for anything that's residential. And so that applies to, yeah, so basically if your lot didn't have the elevation, you would need to look at bringing in fill or doing something to bring the site up.
Okay.
If you wanted to have.
Because that's, I noticed they're filling in Mahone Bay now.
Yeah.
And that's probably
That
why.
would be some of it.
I mean, I know they're making you know,
Yeah.
they're doing the whole waterfront there. and
Yes, yeah.
That's part of it, I assume.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of these setbacks are it's for like habitable spaces as well, so they don't want someone sleeping when a flood event happens within an elevation that's dangerous. So yeah, there is this elevation piece that's kind of a part of it, but again, it depends on the scale, right? So I don't know how you'd have to maybe do a pretty extensive study of the municipality to determine if this lake is 2 meters makes sense, that one 3 meters makes sense. Like, it's a new project all of a sudden. And just moving along, so Bridgewater has 8-meter setbacks. And then they don't have a distance for the exemption, but you can do an exemption if you bring in the right types of reports. So they basically rely on the qualified professional to say what minimum makes sense in this specific case. And then just the last point is site plan approval. So we'll get into site plan a bit, but we now have site plan criteria, but then they don't all make sense for these things. So is there examples of different types of site plan criteria within a land use bylaw? And there definitely is. There's various sets depending on the zone category. Cumberland County, they have the 50-foot setback. You can renovate and repairs as long as it's not further reduced setback from the water course. So they have a limitation on the footprint size. If you do have a lot that's constrained, there is a possibility of developing on it, but you'd be limited to how big you could make it. And then that's, I guess, going back to what I just said about human habitation, they have no main buildings for human habitation can be within a certain elevation from the high water mark. And then again, they have site plan approval with different types of site plan approval, depending what you're doing. So not an exhaustive jurisdictional scan, but definitely useful just to think about what people are doing. And I don't have it on this page, but it also kind of depends when those regulations and policies were developed at that municipality, which kind of goes back to the Antigonish one where 15 years ago, whatever, they had these and they added them, and now they're doing one without exemption type wording. Yeah, so,
Grant exemptions, and you gotta figure out how to justify for one person as opposed to another.
So this qualified professional report is the next page. I think it's fairly obvious that this should be the baseline of approving any type of exemption is getting someone who knows what they're talking about to look at it and run whatever numbers or things they're looking at. So geology, grading of slope, what type of mitigation would work in that certain circumstance. It's got to have, justification. You can't just say, well, this works, that's why we're doing it. Well, why don't you? You can't go back here because of so-and-so geographical feature. So there's also a detailed site sketch that comes in with that, with a location certificate. So a surveyor goes out and they don't survey the whole site, but they survey the area you're looking at for the setbacks and put it on a plan, send it to the development officer with your application. So it's very accurate once they go and do a survey of it. So there is a cost to and time and effort, or cost and time to goes in that for the landowner. It's just another consideration. And just noting that Municipal Public Works, they do review plans when we get them for like TAs and things like that, but they don't actually do a detailed analysis. They look and make sure it has the requisite information on it, but we don't have like HRM has like an engineering department and they run all the numbers and such when these come in, but we don't necessarily have that level of analysis that goes on. But it's a qualified professional. We're taking what they're saying for their qualifications, right? So anyway, just any exemption we believe should have this requirement. And we just approved a village plan exemption with a qualified professional report. So this is for the watercourse, water bodies and wetlands, not for the lakefront overlay. You can reduce it by half with justification from qualified professional. And so this is, what council's gone through in the past and approved through the village plan. So that'll come up again when we look at some of the options.
And just
On the
to,
next page.
I guess, speak a little bit more to that when we were starting the village plan review, this idea of a relief mechanism had already come up. And so we can't recall if it was specific direction or it was through a discussion that we realized this would be something desirable. So this was sort of our first crack at doing one of these. And as Paul will outline, one option would be to take this and copy it on the municipal side. The other thing would be to come up with something new and then bring the village into compliance, whatever the new setbacks are. So, yeah.
And this does not apply to lakefront overlay.
Right, and so it could
now,
also be
so.
extended to the lakefront overlay or, yeah.
So the next page is actually this, so this is the first matter-specific options. there could be a decision by council to say, let's maintain that, what we have for that, and then roll it out to, the municipal plan and land use bylaw, and roll it out to lakefront overlay in both sets of plans. And then the second one here is, we have a 10-meter setback. 50% seem to be where places have exemptions, that seem to be where they landed. I don't think there's, it's a bit subjective, I think, objective.
Yeah.
So another option is to basically take this exemption, but reduce or remove or make it a bigger setback as the minimum, or the
Right.
minimum reduced setback.
So rather than going to 10, it could be 15, could be the minimum, for example, or
Or
something
it could
like
be
that.
2, or it could be just
Right.
rely on the
On
qualified
the
professional
To
report.
say in this condition, here's what an appropriate setback would be, yeah.
So, and then to go back to the cottage that was moved, matter, their plan shows an approximate 8.4 meter setback. So, just something to consider.
Yeah.
So we've got, is there any questions? Okay.
That's at the end.
It's at the end, yeah. So then, there's also the matter of, should this be for existing dwellings, let's say, even though it could be other types of uses, or for new, or both? So council could approve a limited exemption where changes are just for an existing main building rather than for new developments. Moving or enlarging a house within the setback, or it could be for vacant lots, newly created lots, vacant lots that were constrained because they were created before some of these restrictions came in. So specific uses or residential uses is something to think about as well. There's also like commercial or industrial. Does it make sense to give those types of uses an exemption? That's something we would have to address in the policies as we amend them. So an example is a commercial wellness building that's just up the road. They did a site plan just before these regulations came in, and they have an 8-meter setback for their commercial business that has an interest of being close to the water, or parts of their use being close to the water. And then also there could be a case where, say there's a house, someone wants to start a short-term rental business, and they want to keep that house but add several more structures, another structure with a number of units in it. Should an exemption be allowed for that existing dwelling in the setback? Because once you add that extra intensity to the site, all of a sudden it's not a grandfathered in setback anymore. It's a change of use. You're doing something new. Setbacks apply. So would you allow that existing house to stay if they're doing something like that? So yeah, residential, non-residential is another consideration. So moving on, site plan approval or development permits. So I think this is kind of the crux, if you will. The exemption of the village plan is development permit process.
And I think just to add again, there's no, with the village plan exemption, so anybody, if they get that report, can go to 10 meters. There's no criteria for why. It's just if the report shows that you can reduce it, you can. So, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's not use specific
Right,
necessarily. So site plan approval, development permit. So site plan approval, they come in with their detailed plans. Development officers review it to make sure it's, makes sense before they approve it. So it's similar to this where you'd be coming in with a plan that's been done by a surveyor and a qualified professional. Development officer would be reviewing a plan to make sure it makes sense, like other site plans. So one of the differences is the appealability and the enforcement versus a site plan and a development permit. So for a site plan approval, unlike development permit, there's a notification that goes out to any landowner within 60 meters. That gives them their rights to appeal. Development permit doesn't have that. And then for enforcement, municipality can remediate an issue for a site plan and charge the cost to the landowner. Development permit, they can revoke the permit for non-compliance, and then there's appealability for the landowner to challenge that matter in the court. So say a lake gets contaminated, the municipality can't just go in and do something about it if there was a development permit and you've identified which landowner has kind of created this problem. Whereas for a site plan, there is that extra ability to actually go in and remediate it. There's also the matter of, on the slide, but how much enforcement can we do? How much remediation can we do is kind of another
Excuse me, Paul,
consideration there.
Councilor Vino has a question?
Yeah, so, let's talk about this just a bit. It's quite a long monologue. We're all hot. So, by site plan approval, obviously to the developer or any applicant, that's the preferred method because there's more assurance that this is gonna work. But backing out of that, there's two sort of criteria we're looking at. One is the setback from the water body or whatever, wetland, and the other one is the elevation. So elevations, the risk that's inherent there is like primarily flood risk, you know, so those are the risk to the developer, him or herself, rather than to the neighbor. You know, we don't want people building in places where they get flood. It could be a taxing effort for our emergency services, insurance. Why did you let me build there? Or people who purchase the property after the fact, they don't realize that there's an issue and sometimes they'll come back on the regulator. The setback itself is a protection for like siltation, primarily siltation of waterways. Not so much for wetlands, although they seem to get gathered up in these sorts of regulations. I'm not sure why, because they aren't damaged in the same way as a sensitive little brook would be. But we tend to lump them all together. Let's pretend they're similar for a moment. Deviating from an elevation is less desirable, obviously, because you know, this is where you get into flood risk, and we don't have very good flood mapping at this point. So these blanket elevation requirements tend to be municipal ways of protecting against that. And you can see with the many examples that you were able to find, most of the times you weren't able, the applicant is unable to vary from that. So I think if we're talking about the ability to provide a relief to this, it would have to be primarily to the setback requirement, not the elevation. Now, an interesting sort of twist on that is like sometimes you may be on a piece of low land and, you know, if you say, okay, well, it's a requirement to maintain a, whatever, say a 2.5 meter elevation off of high water mark. That might not be possible because the topography doesn't allow it, but if it's really flood risk, then it doesn't really matter where the footings are located. For example, you know, if you built the structure on piles and the finished floor where the occupants would be dwelling is 3 meters above the water, then that's not much of a risk, if that's truly the risk that we're trying to prevent. So we have to be careful if we're gonna craft such requirements that we don't make it about the area where the footprint, where the elevation is, but rather the habitable space or the finished floor elevation. As for, should it go by site plan approval or development permit? Well, site plan approval, correct me if I'm wrong, when the applicant comes in, you circulated it to the sort of nearby neighbors, and they have an opportunity to provide comment, but really they're only providing comment on ensuring that you've adhered to the process, if you will.
Yeah.
They're a dispute. So if, for example, we're saying the setback could be, let's say 50 feet or 15 meters, and we're gonna allow you to vary down to 8 meters if you have a qualified person. We don't want the ability to go back and then they're questioning the integrity of their qualified person, and they'll get their own qualified people and argue with, you'll have a battle of the qualified people. That's where I feel like if you're in a development permit situation and you're in a public hearing environment, that then you can get in that kind of uglier, I feel like, uglier situation. Whereas you're not in a site plan approval, I'll give you a chance.
Just to interject, so development permit doesn't require public hearing, that's a development agreement.
Oh, you're
So
right.
development permit,
You're right.
there's no public notification.
Oh, yeah.
So development permit is the
Oh.
lowest level. of
Yeah,
site
you're
plan
right, I'm so sorry.
No, I mean, your comments up to that point were.
No, that's
were
good.
accurate, yeah.
So in that case, then either way would be fine. Yeah, I mean, I'd be inclined to allow by site plan approval then, because it gives you an opportunity to ensure that they've done
Yeah,
that.
and that's the big.
And
that's the
checking
big
those
benefit.
boxes, and then, yeah, I was worried that we would end up with some sort of environment where
Right.
people are questioning the credibility of the professionals they hired.
Yeah,
And that can happen in a development agreement
It can,
situation, and
absolutely.
that's, we want to avoid that. Okay, great.
yeah. So no, exactly.
And really, and again, we're dealing with the siltation
Right.
issue,
That's
like,
the biggest issue.
yeah, because that can actually affect neighboring property owners.
Yeah, and I think, and Paul will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think in general, our overall recommendations are not necessarily to implement an elevation at this point, that minimum elevation. Like you said, flood mapping is being worked on by the province, and hopefully in the next 2 years, we will have access to better flood mapping, and then at that point, it may make sense to look at whatever regulations are up for that. Similarly, on the coastal side, that's where maybe an elevation makes more sense, because your coastline is
That's
very
what's
different,
fun.
but it's the same ocean. Yeah, no, definitely agree with that. And to your point on site plan, absolutely right, that the appeal that is available is only based on essentially that the development officers made an error in approving it. So it's not that the report wasn't good enough, or that they don't like what's happening. It has to be that there was an
The
actual.
qualified person isn't qualified enough.
Right, yeah. If they're certified through their provincial body, then that wouldn't be something that would be appealable.
And also just to wrap that up is, so for a site plan, they send the notice to neighbors. It's not a big notice to everyone. Joe Blow from 30 kilometers away
Yeah.
doesn't have an appeal ability.
Right. It's only the neighbors that get the
And
notice.
these
Warden Weber.
neighbor specific.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, I mean, you want to keep, I mean, we have the setback for a reason, is to protect the water courses and the or, you know, the animals, the fish, the whatever and all that, but I think that what I hear from most people is they want our processes to be as simple as possible. And also, I think from a staff perspective, you want it to be as simple as possible and take as little of your time as possible. So, and the site plan does seem to me to,
It definitely takes more development officer time, than a permit.
it takes more.
More time
More
for site
time.
plan approval, yes, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
easier for the person,
No, I wouldn't say that. There's more submission requirements for a site plan than a development
Than a
permit.
development.
Typically, and like Paul said, if the site plan is the direction that we end up going here, what we would recommend is not just putting it through the site plan criteria we have now. We draft specific criteria that would be more relevant to what this is intended to get at. So we would try to keep it from, we wouldn't want to ask for something that wasn't necessary. But usually, yeah, for our standard site plan approval process, it typically does require more documents and studies and plans than a development permit, so.
From both the person making the application and from our staff.
Yeah, more time on the review end, yeah.
That's.
Now, and again, this is where it really is a balancing act, because the upside, as we mentioned, is enforcement is easier through site plan than it is through development permit. So that's where all of these factors are, that's why we're bringing this to you, says the decision maker.
Okay, that doesn't.
But then the applicant also they have to do a qualified professional report regardless.
Either way, yes,
Either way.
that's right, yeah.
I'm not sure where it's at. I just thought the site plan would be, because what I hear from people on the street is, cut out some of the damn time consuming, this, that, and everything
Site
else.
plan would be more time consuming.
Yeah, well, it's even, yeah, I didn't I thought it would be simpler.
People are waiting months for that.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
way we have way too much time.
Yeah, okay. That's all
So one of the requirements in the site plan approval is a vegetated buffer. It's actually also in the development agreement policies as well. So that's another consideration is, here's the vegetative buffer in the site plan criteria we have right now. 20-meter setback, so basically the whole setback has to be, keep the vegetation that's there ideally, or replace it and maintain it. Only 75%, only 25% can be non-natural buffer mowed lawn, and of that, there's a 3.5 meter width that you can get down to the water.
Paul, we have a question from,
I just, for site, so what you're saying is if we apply our current site plan approval criteria, it would include a vegetative.
Yeah, and this is a piece that we would want to consider whether or
Right.
not to add it.
Is it possible in the documents to have a separate set of site plan criteria that would apply to different types of development? So you
Yeah.
don't have to have the same
No, that's
site
right.
plan criteria
That's
for every development
Yeah,
across the board.
we could split it kind of as, we could have residential, commercial, industrial, and then this would be a whole separate thing for, water course relief or water setback relief, yeah. And basically what Paul's saying here is highlighting that this is currently in site plan and development agreement, and if we were gonna go down in site plan for this is something we would wanna think about, should it be in, should it be not, and then the final bullet there as another consideration is, if it is in, are there any changes we want? We can always adjust those numbers as we go.
You could have a scaled back criteria for the site plan approval for the setback exemption, and you could also scale back this vegetative buffer.
If we
You
felt it was
could not
too
have it.
restrictive, yeah.
I imagine there'd be some kind of consideration in a qualified professional's report, like they're trying to make the runoff not go into the lake too fast.
Yeah.
They can't do it with concrete.
Yeah, and I
So,
think just, and maybe we should have started with this too, because I know we're getting to the point where this is a lot, and there's still some more details to go. So I think, and Tara, jump in, I think ideally what we get here is a general sense of direction
Yeah.
from council. If there's some of these decisions that you're ready to make today in that's great. If not, what we'd aim to do is come back with a more
Yeah.
refined report with still a few options to choose from, so it's,
Right.
yeah.
We
because
can't make
we can't make them all
decisions.
today.
Well, and we can't,
Oh, we can't,
this
yes, yeah,
committee doesn't
understood.
make decisions,
Yeah.
they give direction to staff, so.
Yeah, so if we get sort of a general sense of where you like to go, then we'll bring back what we think are the best options for that approach, and that'll simplify it the next time you hear all this.
It's a lot.
It is, yeah.
So that actually kind of concludes this portion of the talk. So vegetative buffer and kind of what types of criteria you would have for site plan. So then the next 2 pages are those matter-specific options. So this is kind of summing up what we just went through the last several slides. So should council permit by development permit for all land use types or restrict it to existing developments that want to improve their situation? Allow relief by development permit just for existing. So, or maybe just residential, but new and existing. Or perhaps just low density residential. If you just have 1 unit or 1 or 2 on your lot, then you can get an exemption. If you're more intensive than that, maybe it doesn't make sense. Allow relief by development permit only where development is existing and improvements in the non-conforming location are proposed. So that basically talks to the cottage that got moved matter that we talked about. Could it just be for that specific narrow type of change to a property?
So,
And
so
then,
Paul, when you're saying, allow, is that like you're saying relief as a variance? Is that what you're, when you say allow relief by development permit?
Well, like an exemption.
Yeah, relief
Just-
just means lessening the setback. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. I just didn't know if it was just a
Yeah,
variance.
so it's not a
I'm saying
variance.
relief on
Variance would
exemption.
be, would give the development officer flexibility and sort of
Right.
considering what the distance should be. What we're saying and what the legal advice we've been given is that we don't have the ability to do a true variance. So we have the ability to exempt them from the requirements, but it's not a variance where it's variable
Okay.
depending on the site-specific situation. So you could have an exemption that says, you know, if you have the qualified persons report, you're exempted from the setback altogether, or you're exempted from half of it, or whatever that is, but it has to apply the same
Right.
without discretion from the development officer on what that would be.
Yeah, yeah.
So notwithstanding type clause. So then the next page is the site plan application approval. So this pretty much mirrors what's in the last one, except it's site plan versus development. So
So yeah, so you can think, I guess. maybe-
new versus old, residential versus non-residential, just low density.
So and just, sorry to interrupt, but for example, if, you know, if by the end of this session, council is thinking development permit feels like the way to go, then basically we'd be on the last slide, and those would be the further decisions to make at a future meeting. If council decides that site plan's the way to go, then these options would be all further considerations, which again, we'll bring back another report to go through those, so. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
Yeah, no worries. So those are the things to think about for what we got into, but then, you know, going through all the policies we have and what the changes might look like, there are some other considerations. So this next part is kind of going through a few of those. We already talked about the next one, so you don't need a permit if it's 4 or less units in general basic. So if council did want to kind of move ahead of this general basic permit type thing, we could kind of roll it into this as a way to make the watercourse setbacks more efficient. And then also, another factor is there's a direction to move to e-permitting.
It's part of our half projects.
So in the next near future, we'll have some software that will kind of interpret what type of application you're applying for. So if you have to do some complex software manipulation just to make the lakefront overlay make sense, there's just another consideration is this change might be coming down the line
So basically-
fairly soon anyway.
Yeah, the long and short of that is this may be a change that we would be bringing back anyway in order to implement e-permitting.
Yeah.
Because the software is gonna look, when you're making an application, it's gonna wanna know what zone you're in, and then it's gonna know what your requirements are based on that. And like I said earlier, with the general basic zone working the exact opposite way to all the others, but then this caveat of, well, if it has the lakefront overlay, it does need a permit. And this is, Heather's leading this project, so she might be able to speak to it a little bit better, but it seems from the initial research that we've done that would, probably the default software would not be able to do that, and so there would be additional like coding requirements needed, which would come at an expense. So the point to this is to say, if this is something council's willing to consider, there's a few reasons that it might be worth looking at those changes to the general basic zone.
But that it would add a lot more complexity to going through the public participation and all those things if you're taking as of right away from the general basic, but it's an option, so. And essentially, we only have lakes separate from the other ones because of this.
So theoretically, and this is what.
Lakes would just go back in, one setback.
Yeah, so this, what Paul kind of has in the bottom here, and this is kind of putting a few of these things together, so, basically, if the general basic zone was changed, so it did require permits, as it says here, we could remove the lakefront overlay entirely, just go to the water courses, water bodies, and wetlands setback, and that would apply the same way across all the zones, because then the development permit would be the trigger for whether or not that setback applied. So,
Everything needs a permit.
yeah,
But the trade-off, just so the council, because I
Yeah.
see kind of
Yeah.
confusion, right?
Yeah.
The trade-off there is, so you could simplify the water course, water body, wetland setback, and the lakefront
yeah.
overlay.
Yeah.
But the trade-off is that in the general basic zone, most people don't need a development permit. This would flip that. Everybody would need to apply for a development permit. You don't have to have a cost associated with it necessarily, you
Right.
could consider that. But it would add that extra layer of approval so that everybody would be required to,
Yeah.
by
So it would be
default,
it would be
apply
the
for a
same
permit.
as the way building permits work now, which is that everybody requires a building permit. But I do understand, I've been here for 10 years, so I understand that would be a really big change. Yeah, yeah.
And another part maybe for the newer counselors as well is when the new plan came in 2020, before that,
I know you hit it on.
most of the general basic, if not all, was unplanned, right?
No, it was general basic, yeah.
Oh, it was?
It
Okay.
was, yeah. That was since 2004.
Yeah.
That the
Oh, it was
GP had been
2004,
there. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so,
Councillor Vino?
Okay. So let's pretend we're in the general basic zone and it's a 40-acre huge piece of land with a lake on it somewhere. You're suggesting then that if you're going to build, say, a house somewhere on that would go by development permit even if we're not close to that lake?
Yeah, that would be, so it would be like all the other zones. If you wanna build a house, you get a development permit. It makes sure that you're far enough from your side yard setbacks. It's a pretty straightforward, and it would be similar to where it would be a mixed-use zone right now in terms of what we'd be looking for. But yes, that's what we were discussing here is,
Yeah.
yeah.
How would that work now if you were on a 40-acre lot, the
You're a
lakes-
kilometer
If
away
you're
from
on,
the lake.
actually, it's exactly the same right now, because
Yeah,
if you're on a
that's what I'm-
40-acre lot with a lake that's covered by the lakefront overlay, you still need a development permit today. And that's why we're saying, like, the general basic zone today with the lakefront overlay is not the same as it was before 2020, because it used to be, nobody needs a permit. Now it's, if you're subject to the lakefront overlay, you need a permit, which is a complication and people don't understand, don't realize, they're used to saying,
So,
I'm in general basic.
so the issue is that if we make it so that you need development permit and we just do away with that, is that the neighbor who has the 40-acre piece that doesn't have the lake, he's also going for a development permit.
Right,
Right.
yes, exactly, yeah.
All right, and then back to the, like, let's say that the permit was then applied for, and they wanted to put their house nearby this lake.
Yeah.
You know, did we get anywhere? Did we decide on what it is that we want to do in terms of variation on that requirement? It seems like we talked all around it and just moved on.
Yeah, so I think, at any point we could do that, or I know at the end of the agenda, it says, whatever it is, summary of direction to staff, so we'll revisit that, because you're right, we don't, the whole site plan development permit approach for that is, yeah.
Well, it's fine if you want to do development permit, if you think that's simpler, I guess.
Can I, just
absolutely.
for clarification, so
Yeah.
go back to the 40-acre lot in the general basic zone. If there's a lake on the property,
Yeah,
right now, you would need a development permit,
right,
no matter what you're developing on
That's
that.
right.
Single-family home, whatever.
yeah,
If it's not a lake, if it's a wetland on
Yeah.
the 1 to 10,000 map,
right. You don't.
or a river,
Yeah,
if you're doing 1 to 4 units, you wouldn't require a development permit, and therefore,
they can build right on
you,
the
you just
water,
build
yeah.
and, you could build
Build
right
on
on the
those.
water and you could go. Just that layer of complexity that's in there
Yeah.
with the general basic zone,
Yeah.
the way it works, right?
Yeah.
So lakefront overlay triggers on your property, or sorry, a lake on your property
Right.
triggers development permit
One
in the
way or the
general
other.
basic zone,
Yeah.
one way or the other.
Yeah.
If it's a water course, on the 1 to 10,000 map,
Right.
as long as it's not a lake,
Yeah.
you may or may not need a development permit depending on the intensity of the development you're
Right,
doing.
right, yeah. And so that's where, you know, and again, understanding that there's all kinds of considerations, that's where, you know, from an environmental standard, we could be challenged on that. Well, why are you protecting lakes more than the river in the same zone? And, you know, so, but that doesn't mean it's worthy of change. That's just, yeah, these are some of the things from the staff perspective that we see. And so we're using this opportunity to highlight it. It doesn't mean that it needs to change, and you can absolutely make a decision on a relief mechanism for the setbacks without touching the general basic zone if you choose to.
Councillor Vino, are you through?
I guess so.
Councillor Connor?
Thank you. So, let's go back to the 40-acre example.
Yep.
So, I have been paying attention, but
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
I
No,
might,
no,
no, but I
yeah.
might have missed, I might have just drifted a little. But, so, does it reference 40 acres in here, or was Andre using it?
No.
So let's use me as an example.
Yeah.
Okay, so I live on 283 acres, and there's a lake on my land.
Yeah, so that's the trigger. The
So
trigger
you
is
get
the
it
lake,
there.
not
So
the
if my
size.
house, if I lost my house for whatever
Yep.
unfortunate reason.
Right.
Where I live next to Highway 12.
Yeah,
At the front part of my 283 acres.
yes. You should get a development permit.
Okay,
Correct.
so what would I have to do, what would I have had to do before all this conversation?
Just to clarify, like before the lakefront overlay came in 2020?
Yeah. And the lakefront overlay is six. No, it doesn't, I'm not close to, I'm not
Yeah,
within that
and-
60.
Yeah, and so, fair enough, yeah, so prior to 2020, when there was no lakefront overlay, you were just general basic.
Right.
You wouldn't have needed a permit.
Right,
When the lakefront overlay came in,
which is 20 meters?
20-meter setback.
From the lake.
Right, but just listen, because this
I
is the
know,
key
I'm so-
piece.
I'm sorry.
The reason we need the permit is to determine how far back from the lake the house is. Because otherwise, we don't know. We don't get a plan, we don't get anything, because if there's no permit, we don't know what's happening. So that's,
Except the building inspector comes in.
but you go
Right.
talk to a building inspector about doing a development inspection. They won't do it. It's not their job.
Okay,
So,
okay,
and
I
I'm
wouldn't
saying,
want
and
somebody
Chad can
not to
speak
do
to
the
that too,
job.
like, yeah.
department doesn't speak to the.
I wouldn't
No,
want,
it's not that they don't speak, it's that it's different roles and responsibilities that council is delegated
So-
to those individuals,
I,
yeah.
maybe once I leave here today, and I'm thinking about this, but right now, I think I would be laughed
Mm-hmm.
out of the coffee shop if I had somebody in my community that has 300 acres.
Yeah. Yeah,
And I tell them that they can build, as a crow flies,
Mhm.
1.5 kilometers
Yeah.
to that lake,
yeah,
that they're now gonna need this added extra requirement because we can't tell if it's within 60 meters of the lake, or 60,
Yeah.
20 meters, 60 feet.
right, no.
I'm just being honest.
That's, yeah, no,
Being
absolutely,
honest.
you're right, it's an extreme example, but it's a fair example, and it absolutely would occur and would come up, and
Yeah.
to answer the question, it would apply the same as if you were 21 feet from, or
I know.
67 feet from the lake,
get
21 meters. And it's just the fact that, again, this general basic zone, I'll say it, it's backwards. Usually you need a permit, and the permit, the basic part of a development permit is a site sketch. It's not a survey, it's nothing like that, it's literally somebody on a piece of loose leaf saying, here's my property boundaries, here's where my building is, it's gonna be this far from each of these lines. But because we don't have that,
Yeah.
we can't verify that we're enforcing the regulations that are on the books.
So I
Yeah.
guess I need to also give some thought to, for me, as one individual sitting here, what is the reason why I am trying to get into the business, I'll be honest,
Mhm.
of general basic to the degree that we're just discussing now, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm being honest. So I have to think about that.
Yeah, yeah,
Because,
absolutely.
yeah, I have to think about that. Yeah, I have to think about it. And what else? Also too, so, and lakefront overlay applies to water, not just lakes. It's rivers.
No,
It needs to.
That's the other one.
It
Yeah.
needs to.
Well,
It
that's
needs to. If
water
we're
rights.
talking lakes, we're gonna talk all water.
Yeah.
That's my bottom, that's how my position's gonna be.
Yeah,
Because
and-
that's not fair. It's not fair.
Yeah.
Like, let's say I live down closer to Charing Cross. Well, actually, you know what? We just sold land on Gold River, okay?
right.
That was 250 acres.
Yep.
Okay, towards Harrison. So we sold that land. That's a river, that's Gold River.
yeah. It goes into the lake that's protected, but
That's
it's
right.
not protected
That's right.
because
So,
of the
yeah, no,
general basic
this-
zone. Yeah.
This water stuff, if we're gonna talk lakes, we're talking rivers, in my opinion. I'm only
I'm all-
one person.
I am all for that.
Yep,
The
that's
staff
it.
Fully support that.
Yep.
And
Yep.
not to say it's the only solution, but that solution that we
Has
just
to
talked
be.
about, requiring permits and getting rid of the lakefront overlay would make it that way, so
Yeah,
that
so
everything's protected
if we're
the
going in
same.
that direction, I'm not
Yep.
saying I'm there yet, but if we are,
Yep.
then I'm taking another sharp right here, so, yeah,
Yeah, sure.
yeah,
Are you through, Tina?
I am, thanks for now.
Warden Weber?
Yeah, I'm not sure where to start.
Sorry?
This is far more complex than what I thought it was gonna be today. I mean,
That's why we're
Tell
here.
me.
Yeah, I know. But, you know, like, I'm with Tina, like, if it doesn't even apply to a river, I mean, the river, if you're polluting the river, for God's sakes, you're polluting more than you are if you do the lake,
Yeah.
you know?
And that's the system we put in place in 2012, again, because of the general basic zone. It drew that distinction. And also, this is another reason, and this could be seen as good or bad, but if we made it so that wetlands, watercourses, water, all of them applied across the board, it would apply to a lot more properties in the general basic
Yeah.
than just the lakes.
I mean,
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
see a little pond and all that kind of stuff doesn't make any damn difference much, but, you know, like a river, but, and I wouldn't need a permit, like, if my lot was 100 feet away from the lake, but I didn't own the land close to the, next to the lake, then I wouldn't need one.
Right,
Where you could be a mile away on the
Yeah.
big lot.
yeah.
Like,
And that's the trouble with trying to write regulations. It's very hard to write one regulation that applies equally to every single situation that can ever occur.
I know, I
Yeah.
mean, I was hoping to come here today and somehow make it simpler for the public and simpler for you. And I'm not sure how to do that anymore.
I mean, we do have some options in here that would do it. Now, some of those may come with decisions that aren't feasible or desired. But, I mean, and to,
I mean, I want to protect the water course. I totally agree with trying to do that, but
then
in the simplest fashion possible.
yeah, so a place to start might be whether or not we want this change to affect the general basic zone. Because if it doesn't, then we can talk with our existing permit structures, and that might make things, like, so again, if you wanna make a simple relief option, what's in the village plan is a simple relief option. You can go up to half with a qualified person's report.
Well, that
So
makes
that's
sense.
pretty
to
But
me.
it doesn't apply to the lakefront overlay.
But it doesn't deal with the lakefront overlay, which is all your lakes. It's, so, I'm almost starting to think that maybe the discussion around whether or not there's gonna be any changes in general basic is the place to start. It also depends how council wants to, look at environmental protection. Is it only important to protect the rivers and lakes in areas that are more developed versus the rural areas? Because that's essentially what we've set up now, is everything that's in mixed use is more important to protect than the rivers and wetlands in the general basic zone. If that's okay, then, so, yeah, there is a lot to this. It's not simple.
No, I guess it isn't.
Are
And the
you,
lakefront overlay came in, so there was some way to protect lakes
Right.
in the general basic.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm not sure where the discussion went at the
Well,
time,
I-
not to put it on the watercourse
I
wetlands as well.
agree with the
but-
setback requirement, if you're building on a lake, to help protect the quality of the water in the lake and the animals that live there and all that kind of stuff. But it should be simple. Well, I know.
Well, and the simplest thing is to leave things as they are. Council wanted a relief option, so the simple, as we saw,
Well,
many,
if we give
many
a relief
municipalities-
option based, can't we just do that based on certain criteria?
Well, that's basically what we've got here, it's just which criteria and which
Yeah.
process.
And
yeah.
the policy has to be crafted in order to, like, there's 10 different sections of the policy that I have to make sure it changes or doesn't change to make sure that it fits whatever the exemption is.
Well, I can see where you might want to give an exemption if it was an existing lot that existed before any of these laws came into place. And there are plenty of them out there. You know, okay, I own a lot now, I'm not allowed to do anything with it because it was divided and sold to me way before the laws were in place. So I can see why you might want to give an exemption to that particular person to some degree, you know. And if it's an existing house and it was there before all these laws came into place and you wanted to put a deck on it or something, you know, I can see maybe you might want to do that, but other exemptions, unless they can prove that from a professional that it's not as close to the water, I don't.
Sorry, Ellen, Councillor Church.
Thank you.
I just think we have to think about the reason why we want to do this is to protect the waterways and the lakes. And the example that Tina gave is not unique. There's many of those properties that would say go up the Windsor Road, people build on the highway, except they might have a area that goes right back to the lake. And sometimes common sense doesn't prevail, and I know it's a different matter when you get into clear cutting and forestry and you see all of the rivers exposed. It's quite alarming, but it's happening. And I think it's gonna happen more, so we just have to be very cautious that we try to protect what we can with the waterways and the lake. But I mean, common sense, I mean, if you're building a house on a 100-acre property and your house is by the highway and you're a half mile from the lake, you shouldn't be, you know, restricted too much. That's just my thought on it.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe,
But that's what we have now, though.
Well,
Well, then
maybe
leave
we
it.
should leave it alone. The biggest issue is under what circumstances would we give an exemption?
Councillor Connors.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. So thank you, and Councillor Church, I appreciate your comments. I was gonna use that as an example, because it's, I mean, at my age, I'm not doing anything, right? It's not me, but I'm concerned, I'm thinking about everybody else that I know up the Windsor Road, Aspatagan Peninsula or Blandford, as you say, Highway 12, all that inland area. I mean, there's generations of families with water access and large lots and so on. So, yeah, I was actually, if we go back to when the municipal plan review was introducing that 20 meters and 60 feet, I was fine with 20 meters, 60 feet the entire time. I believe that there were 2 councillors that weren't in favor as it got closer and closer, but then they did, and that's all on record, I don't have to say their names or anything. Yeah, so I was fine with that, because that's what makes sense. You know, 60 feet, I think in feet, that's
Yeah.
reasonable,
Yep.
that's reasonable. I had no problem with that. I had some pushback until we chatted about it, you know, in emails and people seeing me on the streets of New Ross and so on. But the clear cutting piece and the, all that, the common sense not prevailing, it's not necessarily the generational owners of the lands that are doing that, if at all. They're not the ones. And it's also people that aren't necessarily developing homes, they're just cutting trees 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because that's their living, and they're just parachuting in, contracting and doing that, and they're ruining everything, right? So, yeah, again, I don't know, right? This has got to be for the taxpayers, the residents of my area, the municipality, and what makes sense, and I'm not there.
yeah.
Heavens.
Councillor Vino.
Okay, so, if we're talking development permit, that would indicate, on it, that the requirements for minimum distances from lakes, which exist now if there's a lake that's on the PID. But maybe we'll change that so that it indicates that there are minimum distances required from lakes or other water courses. So, which is, it seems like getting the body language on the room that that's what is desirable if we're sincere about our desire to protect water courses. And it wouldn't matter if the PID had been a lake or not, then every PID that's in development in the general basic zone would then require, it would require that development, that sketch that comes with a development permit.
Right.
Okay. And then if then there is a requirement then to be within some sort of distance, that's when we get into the discussion of
Right.
of what mitigative measures and at what point you have to do
Yeah.
other things beyond just show that you're outside of the requirement. So if the requirement were, say, 15 meters and you're, or 20 or whatever it is that we decide arbitrarily is gonna be the amount, then if we're within that, then it's to this council then to decide how much would then, not variance, but how much would we be able to lift off of that if they were able to present further documentation that won't be a risk.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm okay with all those things we just discussed together. And then, of course, if you're doing other types of, like, because I think a lot of times we think of this as just single-family homes. Obviously, if you're gonna do multiples of them, you know, some amount. I think in other jurisdictions, usually it's like 3 or more. Or commercial, then you may have to, if you're within this, whatever this buffer is that we've decided, then you may have to have something more sophisticated, like a stormwater management plan. If you're just doing a single-family home, then maybe it would just be this QP report letter kind of thing, so it's a easier, more attainable thing if you just wanna build a cottage or something, yeah.
Yeah, and we didn't even quite get to it, but Paul does have a slide on those. Do we have higher requirements for more intensive developments?
Oh, yeah, and that makes sense too.
Absolutely, yeah. So, yes, and I think what you just described would essentially be something that staff would definitely support that approach. So I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be a general consensus that wherever we go, that the setback should apply to rivers and lakes equally, that it shouldn't be different in different areas.
So just for clarity, because there's the lakefront, which has, the lakefront overlay, which has the vegetated buffer piece, or the
Surfaces.
surfaces, impermeable
Yeah.
surfaces. And then there's the water course that's just setback.
yeah.
Are we looking at the carrying the impermeable surface into the water courses?
That's a good question. I would tend to recommend just the setback.
Yeah.
I think that's
Good.
going around the room, and even just from an administrative point of view, the impermeable surfaces is trickier to keep track of, because if somebody builds their house and then paves the driveway later, we don't always know when they pave it, so it's harder to track that percentage, even though it's a nice idea. So, yeah, I would say we probably just look at the 20-meter setback to apply across the board, however we end up with that.
And get rid of the impermeable surface around the lakes, or?
Well, assuming we take the two and merge it into one,
Right.
then yes, drop the impermeable, so it's the same regulation, whether it's a river or a lake. One question, oh, no, sorry.
Well, you don't want asphalt along the lakefront.
No. That's why I was
Yeah,
trying to
no,
get clarity.
That's fair, okay, okay, but it's okay on the rivers?
Why not?
Because we just said to treat them the same,
Why wouldn't it be the
so maybe we
same?
keep it in, maybe we keep the impermeable surfaces in, okay. And so that, again, just as a reminder, is basically within the buffer, within the 20 meters, that only 25% of that could be paved or buildings, combination of the two. So- Okay, yeah, no, we can absolutely keep it.
25% within the entire buffer.
Right,
Okay.
yeah.
It can't be paved.
Impermeable.
I'm trying to think of like a river, winding river, and that the buffer splashes way inside the lot, but they have to bring the driveway through. That, as
That's
long
what
as
I
we can
wanted to
accommodate that.
Yeah.
Another question on which maybe we get some idea here. So it's been mentioned that potentially wetlands should not be subject to those same setbacks. Is there any sort of consensus?
I think that I've seen in the past where wetlands tend to get grouped together with watercourses, but they don't behave the same way.
It's not the same.
And I don't know why, I think it's just,
Yeah.
I think it's a bureaucratic thing that happens, but, You know, a little bit of silt doesn't really bother a wetland the same way as it does a sensitive little brook with fish and frogs and all that stuff. And I just, I think, and plus, oftentimes wetlands can be very small, and then you get into the discussion of what, is it wetlands of significance, you know, and all this stuff, and it gets murky, and I'm not sure that there's really a lot of benefit to it, frankly.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother it.
I disagree with your comment on wetlands, and maybe we need to do a little exercise on that. Wetlands are very important, and it, to the system, yes, and it provides, you know, coming into, say, Chester, there's lots of wetlands. There's one right by the 103 where they just cleared all the land, and I'm looking and thinking, well, probably in 2 years, that won't be a wetland anymore. But, so I think they are important. We shouldn't ignore wetlands.
Councillor Vino.
Wetlands have, and water courses have protections through the environment. So, like, what we're talking about, like, with, back to the original goals here, is elevation requirements are to protect people from themselves. Setbacks are to protect
Runoff.
people, their neighbors, from them. So nobody wants you to silt up their lake in front of their house and kill all the fish in front of their house and all that stuff. But environment also has regulations that prohibit that. So what we're trying to do is bring our development requirements in line with what the province would like to see, to help people, to help bring people along. Like I said, I don't think wetlands are as sensitive to like silt. If you bring a driveway along a wetland, it doesn't mean as much to that wetland as if it does that if you do it alongside a brook. So I guess, I think that, I'm not saying they're not important. I'm just saying their sensitivities are different.
Warden Weber.
Yeah, I just agree. I mean, I just think that we need to separate, wetlands are significant, and even the piece we own, Windsor Road, we can't build on it and do things with it unless we meet provincial environmental regulations. I just think we need to separate them out, or else we'll be here, we'll never do this. I mean, it's not quite the same as needing a 20-foot setback. It's a whole different ballgame to me, wetlands are.
It does change the scope of what we're talking about. We have a lot of rivers, don't get me wrong, but when you add the wetlands
You
in there, it
totally
is a
how
lot.
you even identify them and
for
where
better
they
or for
are
worse,
and
but-
what they are.
Yeah.
I just think that the plant, you guys have a hard enough job. But I think we need to, you know, provincially and federally and municipally, you know, people want to build. Like the housing is a big issue. And the easier we can make it without going crazy, and I know it's hard for
Oh,
you
yeah.
guys,
Yeah.
absolutely. But I think we need to look at all of that. Because you can go too far in one direction. And I know it's hard for you, but, you know, we need to make it easier for people to build. Just my opinion, and I don't mean let everybody build on the lake, not necessarily, but we have to make the process easier. And, anyway, that's all I have.
Yeah.
So, continue. Well, just for direction, Tara, because we have a public meeting at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
So, what do you wanna do? There's snacks there. We might need a bathroom break. I know I do.
How are you feeling? I feel like you've gotten.
Do you guys have any direction?
I was gonna say,
I
I
still
feel like
have quite a few.
there's still a
spots
bit to
here,
go.
Okay.
I feel like we've made progress for sure. I think it's clear we want it to apply to both rivers and lakes. Wetlands are still a question, but that's easy to keep as an option to tack on.
Right, so you're talking
or
about
leave out.
additional protections. We're still not at the exemption piece of it, right?
Right. The exemption piece is, although we have heard that we want to keep it simple.
Right.
And not overcomplicate it, as long as it's doing what it's intended to do, which is protect the water from runoff. So that's helpful feedback,
Yeah.
even though we haven't gotten, down to the super detailed level. Yeah.
Are you
But I
hearing,
just wanted to put a small bow on the whole
Yeah,
lakefront
perfect.
overlay versus the setback from a water course. So I think part of why we are where we are with the lakefront overlay is we could actually map the edges of lakes.
It's hard to map the
If you want to try to map the 1 to 10,000 water courses identified on the provincial mapping, which aren't really accurate to begin with,
That makes
how
sense.
do you actually, I think that was likely one of the reasons that Lakefront Overlay had to have its own map, or could have its own map. So that's where you might get into a bit of a hornet's nest with actually saying where this, and I'm not sure why there was no just,
No,
why
that
this,
is
why
not,
wasn't there just a setback from lakes rather than an overlay? Because they are subtly the same, subtly
we
different.
can talk about that, there's reasons for,
anyway,
there's reasons for
just
all
wanted
of
to
it.
say
The
that.
primary one was that there's no development permits in the general basic zone. So we had to devise a brand new system to make that work. The other-
Councilor Vito, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, the other reason that the lakes are mapped is because there is no definition of a lake. So to your point, what about a pond? We had to pick and choose, and that's why we had to map it. Whereas the 1 to 10,000 is constantly evolving, and so we can just say if it's on there, it's relevant. If it's not, it's not. The lakes, we had to say what was a lake basically, because even in
Because there were a different set of regulations that applied to the lakes versus.
yeah. So yeah.
If I may offer, there isn't all that much left in here, but I think it would be nice to at least go over the combined options that I have here. We don't have to do it right now, we can take a break, we can do it after, but that's your decision.
25 minutes.
Andre, sorry, Paul, Andre, you go right ahead, try to keep it brief on
I'd
you,
like
please.
to remove this requirement to be mapped on the 1 to 10,000 because that isn't accurate. And of course, it won't capture all the streams and rivers and all that stuff. So to me, if we're gonna write a bylaw, it should just refer to a water course as defined in the Environment Act. And then, because some of them are smaller and some of them are bigger, that's when you get into the exemption part of it, where you can vary, maybe it's 15 meters and you can vary down to like 77.5 meters or something. Not vary, but whatever you wanna say. You know, for a single family home with a QP report, and if it's commercial, then a stormwater management plan. To me, that's a way of dealing with it, and it gives you reasonable spacing. If you have a small brook or something in your property, you keep, 25 feet away, reasonable. You know, you just need a QP to help you to manage the stormwater, and if it's a commercial thing, then you have that broader plan. Those are reasonable things to ask, I think. I've never liked the mapping aspect of it because of the inaccuracy of it. And it's not, if we're interested in brooks and rivers and all that stuff, it's not a tool that's usable.
Tara would like to ask.
Yeah,
a
I
question.
just, one of the things I think you're going to need direction on and clarity on is there an appetite from council to move to requiring the development permit in all of the general basic zone? And I think that's a key thing you need to have as a
It's the
takeaway.
simplest,
Yes,
if it's the simplest
I
process.
think it's gonna have to.
The one piece, and we can think about this, because maybe there's something that, without the 1 to 10,000, it then becomes a matter, and I understand based on the Environment Act, but then who's gonna confirm that? So does that mean we have to ask for, for cases where they're not looking for an exemption, do we still need a survey to determine that they're 20 meters back, right? And that was why we chose the 1 to 10,000, because there didn't seem to be a better option.
So if they're gonna provide a site sketch on the requirement for the site sketch,
Yeah.
you're gonna have to ask them to.
Please
confirm.
use your microphone, sir, if you'd like to speak. Just gonna keep you in line. There you are, sir.
I remember you speaking a number of times this morning.
It's all right, I'm not in that chair now, excuse me. Go ahead.
Okay,
So
it'd be
what I was
based
gonna
on-
say, I think you put the onus on the developer,
Okay, yep.
as is with many other regulators. They often will put the onus on the applicant to provide the information that is requested.
Right.
And should they fail to,
Or if they lie to you.
then you have to deal with it after the fact, and that's just the nature of this business, I think.
Right, okay.
Councilor Connor,
Thank you, so I'm just
sorry, Tina.
taking notes and trying to digest what's being said and taking it away and bringing it back, after I've had a chance to think about this for a bit. So the question is, are we looking to require a development permit in all the general basic? Right? And then the comments were just made around site sketch or hopefully not a survey,
Right,
but,
right, yeah.
you know. So I guess in terms of, again, looking at examples of Aspetuggin, Windsor Road, and New Ross, I'm just gonna use those as examples. So in terms of what would constitute a sketch, would that be, again, I'm gonna keep using myself as an example. So, not a surveyor, not an engineer.
Right.
I am looking at rebuilding my house that I've lost in a fire, right, let's say. Or no, okay, we
That's-
won't use that as an
yes,
example,
thank
that,
you,
no.
'cause there's some extra stuff
That's
that
right,
can
there would be
apply there,
something,
yeah.
okay, so I'm gonna build a new house, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Roof
Downsize,
caved in or
downsize,
whatever,
okay,
yeah.
so, yeah, so still have the same property, same situation. Am I able to, as a layperson, not I'm
Yep.
not gonna do this online.
Yep.
I'm gonna be doing all this,
Yep.
walking it in, and I'm able to do a sketch
Yep.
and say that I am 1.2 kilometers from the lake.
Yeah, yes, the answer is
Okay.
yes. I wish, Heather unfortunately is at a conference, because we
Sure.
wanted to have her here to speak
No
to
worries.
like these specific questions, because
Right.
she is the one, so, and this is my best understanding, we will have her here when we come back
Yeah.
with,
Yeah.
you know, a more
Yeah.
flushed
Yeah.
out, options.
Yeah.
Typically, the way they operate, and I don't know exactly where they draw the line, but let's say the setback's 20 meters.
Yep.
And you propose to be at 21.
Yep.
They're probably gonna ask
Oh,
for a
yeah.
location certificate.
Absolutely.
If you're double the setback, they're yeah, so common sense does have a
Common
role in
sense,
all of
yeah,
this.
common sense, yeah.
But, yes, so if you're a kilometer from the lake, that's gonna be very obvious.
But then
yeah.
there are properties that are less than a kilometer,
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
so,
you know.
and I think it's usually in the range of like, again, if, I wouldn't wanna be held to this, Heather can confirm, but I would, in my estimation, it's something like if the 20-meter setback, if they're more than 50% of that away, so if they're 30 meters or more, that's probably more than enough to, yeah,
So,
that's right.
Also too, just to continue, again, this is something I'm gonna have to give thought to. The municipal plan review was very extensive.
Yes.
We went around to each of the districts, we had 2 engagement meetings in each of those districts, and it was an ongoing discussion. And people went from session to session because they still wanted to learn more. I guess I need to see that this is gonna be an engagement with our communities of impact. I'm not gonna sit here and secretly make decisions, people aren't watching this, they're not gonna check on YouTube, they're not. But I guess we've got a couple of breakfasts with councils coming up. I'm not gonna float the idea, but maybe it can be floated, and see what the room in New Ross says on June 11th, and when we go down in Chester Basin and Western Shore, in the fall, and down in Aspetuggin. I mean, again, this is gonna make a difference to people, so I get if we have, zoning and safety and environmental stuff and all that, but I mean, this links into the municipal plan review for me, and we took the time to do that.
Yeah, no,
Again, it's
I'm-
one person, and if I'm voted down, at least I can say that this is what I've tried to my communities throughout the municipality.
And just as a reminder, this was something council wanted in relation to a specific property owner and an issue that.
2, the Swinnemers and the guy that moved his cottage and.
Swinnemers are affected by a different piece of it, but you're right, it's all
Yeah, there was
packaged.
2
Yeah.
that brought this.
So, I think one option is to change nothing. And
It's as simple as-
we, as scary as this sounds, believe me, to me too, within the next less than 5 years, we need to kick off another municipal
Another
plan review. And my intention as the senior planner is to not begin that in 2030 when it's due, but to
That's
begin it
good.
in the next couple of years,
Good.
so we have time. So this could be an item if
Yep.
council determines to put forward to that plan review.
I can't see how you can go out and do this without getting involved in the whole damn
That's the
thing.
it catches up into the zone, so that's just something else to throw. out.
Councilor Vino, please make it brief.
Mr. Riley.
I just wanted to go back to the whole site sketch, which is sort of precipitated all along discussion, but please bear in mind that all of these rural developments are gonna be they currently come into our development office with an on-site sewage permit from the province, with drawings that show separations of the sewage system to water courses. So like the idea that the information on where these water courses could be or should be or whatever it should be available because it's a requirement
For the well.
Yeah, so like, I don't really see a big problem here in supplying this. All you're doing is adding a bit more information, just a few more dimensions on there to show where the buildings are relative to these same constraining features.
Yeah.
Tara?
I just want to add that currently across the municipality, right, general basic zone or not, you require permits for your development. It's just not necessarily a development permit. You're going to require building permits for everything. We can look at ways to streamline that. And then if you are looking at, just for engagement and next steps, the intention is to come back with what we think we heard, with some potential changes. I would suggest we don't ask for first reading.
No.
At the next council meeting, that we just sort of, right, that we're looking for, this is what we're proposing, or this is what we're considering, this is what we think we heard. Let's send it to our PAs, you could refer it to PACs. You could also have a discussion then around engagement, what you want to do before you go to a first reading. So that's all something that, early stages of
We'll bring
of
back
the
a request
discussion.
for direction, I guess. Yeah.
So just moving forward, Paul, would you like to wrap up? Do what you want?
I just, so the complexity gets a lot more complex
Okay.
if we're taking the as of right out of the general basic. Right now, we have policies for watercourses, wetlands, we have policies for lakefront overlay, we have regulations for each. They can both be tweaked without getting into we don't have to go into the general, it makes it more complex for me. It may take me 3 more days longer to make sure all of the different pieces of policy do what we're trying to do. But we could change the 1 to 10,000 to be something different for the water courses. And then that would trigger permits for a river as well as a lake in the general basic. But it's not necessary right now to get into the general basic change. Yeah, so, and like I said at the outset, that there may be general basic changes needed for other reasons in the near future, in permitting. We don't necessarily have to wrap that into this. It would make it a much more efficient document, but that's not necessarily what needs to happen.
So,
But I do need, there's a number of considerations, as you've seen, so there's 10 other things that we didn't necessarily
get
go
to.
through, but we could go through if there was a request for direction meeting as well, or whatever, but anyway, I just wanted to put out, it gets a lot more complex with the political, with the public engagement, if we do to the permit removal, even though I'm recommending it.
I think what we need to do probably is to sit down, have a staff discussion about what we heard, what we think we heard, what further direction we still need, and then whether that comes back as a request for decision at a council meeting, or whether that comes back as a second session to continue this. And it might be that we continue this session at a later date.
how does that sound? Now, are we good? I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. So moved by Councillor Church, seconder?
No, it's,
Are you, sorry,
We're good. We'll see you in 15 minutes.
I need a seconder for the adjournment, sorry.
Yep.
Seconded by Councillor Coolin. All those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned.